Hey there. So you're diving deep into South Korea's birth rate, huh? It's definitely a fascinating topic, one that's making headlines around the world.
It's one of those things that make you wonder, like, what's going on over there?
Right, like, what's the story?
Yeah.
You sent over some really interesting articles and data, and,
Mm,
well, it looks like South Korea is facing a situation where its population could actually be cut in half within the next 50 years.
yeah, it's pretty wild, isn't it?
Wild is an understatement, I think. So today, let's unpack why South Korea is facing this challenge. And get this, get ready for some really surprising stuff, like
Okay.
matchmaking events,
Yeah.
the impact of the 1997 financial crisis,
Dude, sure.
and the mind-blowing costs of actually raising a child in South Korea.
It's a lot.
Yeah, so let's dive in. What makes this situation in South Korea so different from other countries that are maybe experiencing like a dip in births?
Well, South Korea is not just experiencing a dip. It actually has the lowest birth rate in the entire world.
Wow, okay.
Like,
So how low are we talking? Like, give me
yeah.
the numbers. Paint me a picture.
All right, so the average South Korean woman is having less than one child in her lifetime.
Less than one.
Less than one. And to keep a population stable, you need what demographers call the replacement rate, which is about 2.1 children per woman.
Okay,
South Korea is way below that.
got it.
Back in 1971, they had over 1 million births
Wow.
last year, just 230,000.
That's a huge drop.
It is.
I mean, I knew it was serious, but seeing those numbers side by side, it's pretty alarming. So this didn't happen overnight though,
Yeah.
right? What events led to this decline?
Well, it seems like the decline really started around the 1997 IMF financial crisis.
Okay.
That was a major economic downturn. And it probably shifted how people thought about family life.
Hmm.
And then more recently, COVID seems to have just amplified that trend even more.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tough times make it hard to think about, starting a family. But I read that the government's actually trying to do something about it, right? They're throwing these matchmaking events to encourage people to get married.
Yes, matchmaking events. They've invested a huge amount of money, like $280 billion,
Yes.
into all sorts of programs to try and increase the birth rate.
280 billion.
$280 billion.
Mhm.
Matchmaking events are just one example.
Wow. Okay, that's definitely some outside the box thinking.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder though, are there even deeper reasons why young South Koreans might be hesitant to have children? Even if they do find a partner, is it really just about finding the one?
I think to really get to the bottom of that, we need to hear from the people who are living this reality.
Yeah.
Thankfully, you've got some great sources that offer those firsthand perspectives.
Yeah, we do. We have some really compelling stories from Yoon Hae-bae. She's a 28-year-old woman who actually went to one of those matchmaking events.
Interesting.
And Gianna, 26-year-old aspiring actress. And their stories really stood out to me because for them, marriage and kids don't seem like those automatic life goals anymore.
Yeah, it sounds like their priorities have shifted.
Exactly. Like Yoon Hae is looking for a partner, but Jian is super focused on her career and finding happiness on her own terms, whether that includes marriage and kids or not. I think that's a big part of what's happening, this whole generational shift in values.
That's a really crucial point. But on top of those changing values, we also have to consider the immense financial burden of actually raising kids in South Korea.
Oh, right. I almost forgot. One article mentioned that it costs something like 7.7 times the GDP per capita to raise a child in South Korea,
Yeah.
that's the highest in the world. What does that even look like for, say, a young couple trying to make it in Seoul?
It's an astronomical figure. It's not just a number. It has real consequences. A 2023 government report. They identified housing costs, lack of job opportunities, and a terrible work-life balance as major reasons why people are hesitant to have children.
Wow.
Imagine being a young person in South Korea, starting your career. You're facing these sky-high housing prices, a work culture that demands you work all the time.
Yeah, I can see why starting a family might feel impossible, even if you wanted to. It's a lot to take on.
Yeah, but it's not just about the cost of diapers and daycare, right? There are also some deeper societal structures at play here, too, particularly when it comes to gender roles and expectations.
You're absolutely right. You can't talk about South Korea's birth rate without talking about its issues with gender inequality.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, for starters, South Korea has one of the worst gender wage gaps in the world.
Really?
Yeah. And that combined with traditional gender roles, it just places this heavier burden of childcare on women,
So they're being penalized for having children.
in a way.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of, you mentioned the story of Jihae Mayong, the 37-year-old woman who is married, but she's hesitant to have kids because of her career and what society expects of her as a woman.
Right. It seems like a lot of South Korean women feel like they have to choose between their careers and motherhood.
Yeah, it's a common dilemma. And with limited support for parental leave and this ongoing gender inequality in the workplace, it's a choice with very real consequences for women. So we've got these economic pressures, changing values, and gender inequality all tangled up together. It's
Yeah.
like a perfect storm pushing down the birth rate.
I like that analogy.
So is South Korea alone in this? Or are other countries experiencing something similar?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it brings us to the bigger picture. This is something that's happening in other places as well.
Oh, wow. Okay, so South Korea is grappling with this huge demographic shift. But is this a regional thing? A global thing?
It might be both.
Yeah.
We'll have to look into that. So you're right to think about this regionally and maybe even globally, because South Korea is not alone. A lot of other East Asian countries like Japan, Taiwan, and China, they're all facing similar challenges with declining birth rates.
Oh, wow. So
Yeah.
this is bigger than just one country.
Yeah, and get this. By 2025, the number of women in their prime childbearing years in East Asia is projected to fall below 100 million.
100 million.
Yeah, it's a huge shift, and it has implications that reach far beyond just individual countries.
So what does that mean? What are the implications?
Well, it raises all sorts of questions about the future of economies, social structures, even global security.
Mm-hmm.
It really makes you wonder, what will the world look like if this trend keeps going?
It's a lot to think about, for sure.
Okay.
So we've laid out the problem, but what about the solutions? Like, what can be done to either reverse this trend
Yeah.
or at least lessen its impact?
There's no magic bullet to fix this. We're talking about these ingrained social and economic systems. Some experts even believe it could take decades to make a real difference.
Decades.
Yeah, and it's clear that just throwing money at the problem won't solve it. Remember that $280 billion the South Korean government invested?
Yeah, and even those matchmaking events, as fun as they sound, haven't really moved the needle on the birth rate.
Right.
So I guess getting people together is only part of the equation. What are some of the other solutions that are being proposed?
Well, a lot of people argue that instead of just encouraging people to have more babies, we need to actually focus on some fundamental systemic change. Things like promoting gender equality, creating a better work-life balance, and providing more financial support to families.
Those sound like pretty big tasks. Let's break them down a little bit. What kind of changes would need to happen to actually achieve more gender equality?
Well, tackling the gender wage gap is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
Policies that ensure equal pay for equal work would be a good start.
Yeah, that makes sense. If women are basically being financially penalized for having children, it's no wonder they're hesitant to start families. What else?
Aside from wages, we also need better parental leave policies. And not just for mothers, for fathers too.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's about challenging those traditional gender roles that put the burden of childcare solely on women.
So creating a society where women don't have to choose between having a career and having a family.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where they can have both.
Got it. Okay. So that's gender equality. What about work-life balance? How do we change a work culture that often demands people to work these crazy long hours, leaving them very little time for a family?
That's where policies that promote flexible work options come in. Things like remote work opportunities, flexible scheduling, and access to affordable, high-quality childcare. That could make a world of difference.
Yeah, those definitely sound like things that could help, especially for working mothers who are often juggling so much already.
Absolutely. And it's not just about mothers either. Encouraging fathers to take on more active roles in childcare is also crucial.
Right. It's about normalizing the idea that parenting is a shared responsibility. So we've talked about gender equality and work-life balance. What about financial support? Like, how can we make it more affordable for young people to raise a family? Especially with those sky-high costs we talked about earlier.
Well, your sources mention things like subsidies for childcare and education, affordable housing options, and accessible healthcare.
Those seem like great starting points. But is it just about direct financial assistance, or are there other economic factors to consider?
It's also about giving young people a sense of financial security and creating more economic opportunities. Remember, a lot of the hesitation around having children stems from this fear of not being able to provide a good life for their family.
So if young people feel more financially secure, they might be more likely to take the leap into parenthood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about creating that supportive environment where people feel empowered to make choices that are right for them.
It all sounds very promising, but I have to admit, turning this whole thing around seems like a monumental task. Like, are the experts hopeful? Do they think these solutions can actually make a real difference?
There's definitely a recognition that these changes require some significant societal shifts,
Yeah.
and those kinds of shifts take time.
It's not like flipping a switch.
Right.
We're talking about deeply ingrained cultural norms and economic structures that need to change.
Exactly. However, some experts are cautiously optimistic. They believe that with consistent effort and political will, these changes are possible. They even point to other countries that have implemented similar policies and actually seen some positive results.
So there's hope, but it requires commitment and a long-term vision.
That's the key takeaway.
Mm.
And it leads us to another really important point. We've been so focused on South Korea. But as we mentioned earlier, this isn't just a South Korean issue.
Right, we were just talking about how this is a global trend. So where do we go from here? Like, how do we start thinking about this on a global scale?
Well, let's zoom out and consider the global context.
Mm.
What happens if declining birth rates become the norm worldwide?
Mhm.
What are the implications for the planet as a whole?
Okay, now we're getting into the really big questions. I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Okay.
So we're shifting gears now from a single country to the entire planet. What happens if this trend of declining birth rates just keeps going? What does a world with fewer people actually look like?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's like peeking into this alternate future.
I like it.
And there are all sorts of interesting implications. Some positive, some maybe not so much.
Okay, I'm always up for a good what if scenario. Give me the good news first. What's on the potential upside of a world with a smaller population?
Well, imagine less strain on the planet's resources.
Okay,
A smaller environmental footprint could mean a healthier planet for everyone,
that makes sense.
and potentially less competition for jobs and housing.
Oh, interesting.
So some experts believe that a smaller, more sustainable population could actually lead to a better quality of life overall.
Okay, I can see that. Less competition, more resources, a healthier environment.
Mm.
It sounds pretty utopian. But I'm guessing it's not all sunshine and rainbows, right?
Mhm.
What are some of the potential downsides to a shrinking global population?
Well, think about the workforce.
Okay.
If there are fewer young people entering the workforce, it could lead to slower economic growth,
Right?
and it could put a lot of strain on social security systems that are designed to support an aging population.
Yeah. You'd have fewer young people paying into systems that are supporting a growing number of retirees.
Exactly. It could create some real imbalances.
And what about innovation and creativity?
Right.
Does a smaller population mean a less dynamic society?
That's a really fascinating question. Some argue that, yeah, a smaller pool of young minds could lead to less innovation and cultural development.
Makes sense.
But others say that technological advancements like AI and automation could fill those gaps in the workforce and even increase productivity.
So it's really hard to say for sure what the long-term effects will be. A lot of this is uncharted territory. But stepping back, what are the main takeaways from our deep dive into South Korea's demographic challenge? What lessons can other countries, or even the whole world, learn from what's happening there?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that declining birth rates aren't this simple problem with easy answers.
Right.
It's a mix of economic pressures, changing social values, and these persistent gender inequalities.
That's complicated.
It is. And it's not just about convincing people to have more children. It's about creating a society that actually supports families and allows individuals to make choices that align with their values.
And those choices may not always include marriage or parenthood, right?
Absolutely. The world is changing, and we need to adapt to those changes.
I like.
Another key lesson is that this requires a long-term, multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
We need to invest in things like gender equality, work-life balance, and financial support for families. We need to create an environment where young people feel good about the future and see parenthood as a real option, not this overwhelming burden.
And maybe most importantly, this isn't just a South Korean problem. It's something that's happening all over the world. We need to start thinking about the kind of future we want and how we can navigate these changes together.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And on that note, I will leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
We've talked about the potential economic and social impacts of declining birth rates. But what about the psychological and emotional impact on individuals? If fewer people choose to have children, how will that reshape our understanding of family community and our place in the world?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It reminds us that these aren't just numbers we're talking about. They're people's lives, choices, and dreams.
Food for thought for sure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.